This is a topic I did not immediately leap on, as the reporter from Bloomberg has not in the past been hugely reliable, but I figure it is interesting enough to be worth covering, as broadly speaking, Bloomberg do seem to have some connections, and I think it's interesting to consider come what may. So, a recent report from Bloomberg has stated that Nintendo's internal production planning shows the company is preparing for a stronger market reception of the Switch 2 with 20 million units as an assembly target by the end of March 2027. And this is interesting because only a few weeks ago in their May presentation, Nintendo said that they were aiming for 16.5 million units to be sold in the year, or at least that was their projection for the financial year ending March 2027. So this is quite significantly up, another 3.5 million units. Of course, what many people have leapt on is the idea that this might be a new big game, and we'll discuss that, but I think there are a few possible explanations for this. So let's start with the most attractive one. If there is a new game that is slated for March, why is this not something that Nintendo foresaw only a couple of short weeks ago? Well, there may be some reasons why this could be the case. There aren't that many titles which would be likely to shift nearly 4 million additional consoles in a snap, after all. Animal Crossing is certainly one possibility, but it feels like a longer shot at the moment, although I do think we will hear about Animal Crossing by the end of 2027, most likely. Pokemon we know is coming during the 2027 year, but would they not want to put this out when there's a Switch 2 Lite model, considering how closely tied in Pokemon and handheld gaming have been? It could be a pretty profitable move to put Pokemon earlier in the year, and if they did make this plan with the Pokemon Company, it would have needed sign-off, and therefore it could be a reason for there to be an adjustment. If the Pokemon Company were resisting the idea of releasing prior to a Switch Lite, and Nintendo has, for whatever reasons, said that actually this is the only way that they can make it work, perhaps because the situation with memory is making it very difficult to actually price and produce a Switch Lite at the moment, well, in that case, the Pokemon Company may have made alternative decisions. And while having Pokemon release on a system which does not have a light handheld model could be problematic in some respects for the Pokemon Company, in other respects, you can see that it would drive a lot of Switch 2 sales, and then the game would have a second wind when the Switch 2 Lite version of the console finally releases. Of course, the other possibility would be a new 3D Mario game, and that would certainly draw a huge amount of sales and could easily take it to the extra 3.5 million over and above Nintendo's May projections. At any rate, one assumes that all of these games have various milestones that need to be met to judge whether they're going to be ready for their target windows. And I would also assume that with games this big and complex, we're approaching the end game of their development, even if they're a year or more out. Remember, Tears of the Kingdom had a whole year in testing, so even if these games are due for later in 2027, well, they're probably finishing up the bulk of their development about now. Presumably, therefore, Nintendo does have a bit of flexibility to look forward at a distance of about a year to move games back and forth across their schedule as suits them. Now, the obvious release times for big games during the first half of 2026 would be either the end of the fiscal year in March or in May to ride the hype wave of the film, which releases at the end of April. I've often thought the 1-2 punch of the Super Mario Bros. Movie and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom in consecutive months during 2023 could be effectively inverted for Zelda if they put out a Mario game in May following the Zelda film. But Nintendo now has two sets of post-movie sales figures to analyse. If they've concluded that the impact of the film is less than they think, they may have decided to take a different tack. They can certainly tell quite a lot from the information they have because of the extensive rollout of Nintendo today and the appeal particularly for people to check in at the cinema, which means that on an unprecedented level, they can match up movie viewership to game purchase histories because, of course, if the Nintendo Today check-ins are from people with Nintendo accounts, those Nintendo accounts are probably going to be linked in to their Nintendo Switch accounts if they have them, and therefore Nintendo can triangulate a huge amount of data and make some substantial inferences. Now, what exactly those inferences are, I can't begin to guess specifically, but I think in the broad sense, we might say that they would be looking to see if there is a matchup between the kinds of people who might be interested in the movies and the people who are buying particular types of games. And if there's not a particular overlap between those, then they might think that with a Zelda film, perhaps there's no particular benefit to releasing a 3D Mario or indeed a Pokemon right after it. They might even have discovered other trends and other links that might suggest new possibilities for how to partner up specific games. Or there might be other delays to the rest of their schedule, which has meant they decided that actually they do need to bring a bigger game forward, perhaps because the original game they had for March is one that they're not as confident about releasing. They've done this kind of switch up before. For example, Xenoblade and Splatoon 3, both in 2022, did a little swap, although it was never, to be fair, ever completely confirmed that Splatoon was going to be for July. But Splatoon did take the slot that was for Xenoblade 3, so it appears that they were switched on the schedule. And so perhaps in the same way, if there's a game that is needing a bit more time in the oven, if they've got a Mario title or something else that's quite big that they think will be ready for the window, it would make sense to move it up. At any rate, if they're reassessing their plans, then moving Mario or indeed Pokemon into the current financial year might make a lot of sense at this point, even if it wasn't plan A when they prepared the financial statements at the beginning of the month. And I think they do have enough information, and they will have been continuing to look at it throughout May because of the release of the film in order to make lots of judgments based on the potential of the sales to people who are going to the films. We also need to consider other possibilities though. So Nintendo's need to constantly change tack in response to sales data is something that we have seen a lot of over the last year. We know initial numbers were much stronger than they expected for Switch 2, and then subsequent numbers were quite weak during the holiday season, or at least weaker than they expected. Now, there is a reading of the last year or so of Switch 2 antics as a series of big swing adjustments on pricing, on game release strategy, and so on, as Nintendo tried to juggle supply provision against demand, using price and the pace of game releases as their metrics. And of course, there's been a lot of speculation recently about the relatively low price of some recent Nintendo games compared to their launch window. It's also notable that actually, while there are some significant titles such as Tomodachi Life and Bacopia, generally speaking, the truly major iconic AAA games which would appeal to a very, very broad audience, your Animal Crossings, your Marios, have been radio silent for a long time, and I do suspect that a part of their thinking is that they don't yet need to reveal these kinds of major games to drive people who are going to buy the console out of prospective entertainment later on. They kind of want to sell to people who are going to buy a specific game at a specific time, rather than people who are just anticipating future possibilities. Obviously, if they were desperate to sell them, then they could just reveal lots and lots of new content early, and that's something that they may do. But in general, they do like to keep their cards closer to their chest to avoid any of the kind of embarrassments that we saw, particularly with the early Switch and announcements like Bayonetta 3 and, of course, Metroid Prime 4. Now, I don't necessarily think, though, that game scheduling changes are the only or even the most likely reasons for adjustments such as this, assuming, of course, there are even these production adjustments at all, given the broad unreliability of Bloomberg in the past. Nintendo may view that having a significant amount of stock on hand could be useful to them for other reasons entirely. For example, let's consider supply chain logistics. If there are particular key parts that they can acquire now, especially against a backdrop of escalating prices, they may consider that they would rather just make the Switch 2s now and have them stacked in a warehouse at probably a relatively minor cost for storage than produce at a slower pace, but of course face the potential of price escalation if they can't secure the parts they need going forward. It's also the case, I imagine, that it's a pretty febrile environment trying to compete for some of these resources at the moment, and so particular negotiations won't necessarily be as predictable. At the very least, it allows Nintendo to secure their prices for a while, and having excess stock probably isn't that big a problem to the long term, as this clearly is not a Wii U situation. For all that people are down on the Switch 2, this thing will continue to sell, and they will shift all of these units eventually, and perhaps even quite quickly if the Zelda movie is successful. Another reason to bump up stock that's completely separate might be if they are anticipating a change to their production processes in the new financial year. Let's say in April they're going to want to pivot to producing Switch 2 Lites. Well, if that's the case, they may decide to shut down some of their production lines for the main Switch 2 production in order to accommodate the Switch Lite booting up. And I imagine there would be some transition time because they're going to need to do their quality controls and they're going to need to be checking that everything is going according to plan. Therefore, if they have decided that they are going to try to bring a Switch 2 Lite to market during 2027, perhaps as soon as July or September, then this would be an ideal time to bump up their stock of Switch 2, knowing that they are going to be pivoting to something else and they're going to want to have a number of units of stock on hand to see them through that transition. At any rate, there are a number of potential reasons why Nintendo might make this change if they even are. It's very difficult to speculate exactly on why, but ultimately I think the same fundamentals remain true, which is that Switch 2 is broadly on a track to sell consistently well. I think selling 20 million in a single year is going to be ambitious, as it always was. Even the original Nintendo Switch didn't generally sell 20 million in a year, and it was only a massive spike during the pandemic that really changed perceptions on this front. However, I do think that Switch 2 will last for a long time, and over the very long term, it should continue to sell very healthily indeed. And even if it doesn't ultimately outstrip the Nintendo Switch, well, that is possibly one of the best-selling consoles of all time, so all things considered, that's not the end of the world. Thank you so much for watching. Do check out the Patreon for early, ad-free and exclusive content, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.